Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where I take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of big finish audio dramas, one episode a day, 7 days a week, and today on the 1st of November, 2019, starting to look at the second televised Peter Davison story, Forward to Doomsday, which is actually the first Peter Davison story produced, and I say that because that's actually going to go in quite a bit. So today we're starting with part one. Now, Forward to Doomsday is written by Terence Dudley, who directed a story for the last season, which is odd that you'd have, a story by someone who's a director, but I mean, if they're a good writer, they're a good writer, but sadly, at least from this first episode, Dudley's not that good of a writer. I say this because this story starts out incredibly weak. The first thing that really strikes you, well, one, we open with, what seems to be what's becoming a common establishing shot, especially among, not good Doctor Who stories, is a long establishing shot of a spaceship going by, because Star Wars did it, and it's the year's 1982, so, yeah, it's, all but one episode, all but one, sort of thing about this story is that we start with the establishing shot. Now, Star Wars is the thing. That's really what I'm getting at here, is that they're like, yeah, we're doing a Star Wars establishing shot, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It just doesn't really do a good job at making things interesting. This is a story where you have you have the entire the entire story building based on this this idea of, oh look, we have we are doing an establishing shot. Now, then you get into the actual meat of the story, and you could argue that the spaceship idea is interesting. There's this idea of a bunch of different, you're on this spaceship, it's run by three Urbankins, who are these like frog-like aliens. One's called Monarch, one's called Enlightenment, one's called Persuasion, and they're heading to Earth, and they visit every 2,500 years. Interestingly, and they're 4 days away from Earth, which I'm guessing is the reason the story's called Forward to Doomsday. 4 days till they come to Earth and probably try to take it over, because, yeah, it's clear that they're meant to be the villains of the story. Which, that's fine. It's standard Doctor Who fare at this point, that the villain of the stories is built up like this. But what is interesting is that the story itself, the story itself kind of builds, it basically builds the idea of they're on this spaceship, and surprise, there are a bunch of humans from different cultures. One from Athens, Greece. One is an Australian Aborigine. One from the Mayan civilization, and one from, one, I guess, from ancient China. And they are all living on this ship. That's honestly, that's really how much that's one of those things where you where you really you really have the entire the entire story builds builds up builds up the entire the entire story, is just that. And the big cliffhanger here is, so there's a point where Tegan draws pictures of fashion, and the Bacons enlightenment and persuasion disguise themselves as Tegan's drawings, which is a weird cliffhanger. I don't know why it's supposed to be threatening. It's just weird. Like, again, this is a story that, I'm going to be honest, isn't this isn't that great of a story, and it's not that great of an opener, because there really isn't much plot that happens here. It's just sort of setting up a setting, and aliens exist. There's nothing that interesting happening, and what makes it, you'd think that maybe, oh well, then maybe it's just a look. We're doing a story with, with these characters, and they're gonna be possibly on, we're focusing on the characters, but that really doesn't work, because in focusing on the characters, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes here, you're doing what's happening is that the entire story is basically being done through this we're focusing on the characters gambit, which isn't really what's happening. Really what's happening is that the characters are kind of being focused on, whilst they're not actually learning anything about them. Like the Doctor, Tegan, Nyssa, and Adric are all here. All the actors, this is the first story they filmed together, so you kind of maybe expect a little weird chemistry things. They feel like they don't like each other. Like, this just feels like there's just a bunch of animosity between the characters in this story, in this episode. Like, they're just sort of all on edge. They're also written just as people. Like, Tegan is incredibly whiny about getting back to Heathrow for her job. That's basically her that's basically her sort of character trait. And she and Adric for some they yell at each other, and for some reason Adric is sexist, like, oh, you're a woman or something. It's really weird. It is a really just a weird way of doing the story, and it's just a weird way of getting these characters together and into a setting. It's not great. So overall, I'm going to give For Doomsday Part 1 a 3 out of 10. Alright, it's the 2nd of November 2019. I just finished watching Part 2 of For Doomsday, which takes any potential quality of Part 1 and plummets it. Now, why do I say that? I say that partially mainly because of what happens in the middle of this episode. This episode has this sort of idea that maybe the audience will believe, oh, the Bacons, maybe they're not the villains, maybe nothing creepy and sinister is going on here, which just doesn't work. This is a Doctor Who story. We know that the obvious frogs that are running a ship, that they are leaving their planet, which has been destroyed, but didn't actually open with that. They said that they're heading to Earth for the final time because reasons. It's it's that doesn't work. But also, this episode spends a good, like, 5 to 10 minutes in the middle just on a cultural dance break for, like, all of the cultures that are on this ship that were stolen from Earth, which, like, okay, I get it. It feels like it's trying to be world building and exposing you to a new culture, but there's a story to be told here. Taking time just to watch these, like, 3 dance breaks in succession really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't make sense, like, within the terms of just the story that no, it's okay, we can stop to dance and, be dancing for a good period of time. Like, it's something that just the story suffers because of it. Like really, this isn't a story that should be spending time. That shouldn't be spending time. Sort of just doing this stuff with, with this whole, with this whole character. It just it doesn't it doesn't make any sort of it doesn't work as a story to be like, hey, here's this random dance that comes out of nowhere and basically leads to nothing. The story itself is incredibly weak. Like, nothing happens in this episode, like, except the Doctor and Tegan get split up from Adric and Nyssa because the Urbacans are like, oh right, Adric and Nyssa are intelligent. And it's like just scenes of them wandering around exploring the ship. I think the idea is that it's sort of like look, we're exploring an interesting setting. We're doing some world building, but Terrence Dudley's talents as a writer don't extend far enough to make the world building heavy plot work well. That he fails on that account. That this isn't a plot where you want to be like, right, where we want to be like, right, we're doing heavy world building, and heavily being heavily influenced on a world by focusing on a world and building out just the different aspects of that world. It doesn't work well. It's like we don't need to see all of the different things on the ship and how they get to grow their food and how everyone on the ship works together in sort of a colony. It's not that necessary for the story to work. This is a story all about characters doing basically just being there, sort of, for the entire for the entire story. It's not really a story. It's not really it's not really a story that does the plot working. And it's building up to this sort of quote unquote big twist. The quote unquote big twist here is, I think is basically that it's not the Doctor. It's just that these people aren't the descendants of the people taken from Earth. They're robot android copies, and that's how they get this magical technology. It's not a very good story because of this. It's just sort of and it's sort of the idea is that it's the same person, which doesn't work, because that's just sort of like you're a copy. You're not the same person. Honestly, this is just it's overall it's a weak story. So overall, I'm going to give For Doomsday Part 2 the weakest score for a Peter Davison episode yet, a 1 out of 10. All right, it's the 2nd of November 2019. I just finished watching Part 3 of For Doomsday, the third episode. It's just as bad as the second. Like this is a story that really isn't concluding, and I think that's partially down to one. Terrence Dudley's plot does not have enough time to sustain a full 4 episodes. He has maybe 2 episodes. He has like maybe 2 episodes in him with this concept, and he just sort of tries to pad out the 2 to 4, which is perhaps one of the worst examples of padding in a Doctor Who story is just this padding out this 2 episode story, which could probably have been wouldn't have been amazing, but it would have been okay. It would have been decent. There may be some okay ideas here, but it's just it's so boring. You have the first big criticism. It's a criticism everyone talks about it. So this if you've seen anyone else talk about For Doomsday, Adric. This is the episode where Adric becomes one of the most insufferable companions in Doctor Who. Now that's nothing against Matthew Waterhouse. As far as I can tell, in the audios he's great. I'm sure he's a great person. And I'm glad we get more Adric with Big Finish because they actually write him. They write him better there, but in For Doomsday, he is just such a poorly written character. One, they write him like he's much younger than he's supposed to be. They write him. Terrence Dudley makes it feel like Adric in this story is supposed to be like 10. He's not. He's supposed to be, I think, like about the age of Matt Waterhouse. He's about like in his late teens. I think is like sort of the actual idea, and they just kind of make him an idiot. Like he trusts Monarch even though like everything about Monarch should be suspicious. Like this is like the character isn't the character of Monarch isn't making any sort of like effort to hide that. No, he's definitely the villain, and he's looking to be the to have to basically have a he's looking to take over Earth. Like this shouldn't be a surprise. Like Adric gets brought in and Adric also gets brought in no, he wants to give the Earth immortality and save them from themselves because humans are idiots, which isn't. It's not a very good story in that aspect. It's one of those. It's an aspect of the story that really doesn't work. The whole episode 2 cliffhanger was that all the inhabitants of this giant ship are androids. The problem with that is that it's sort of doing it, and it's trying to do it, and he wants to offer Adric the chance to be an android. But the script seems to act like the android duplicates are the same as the original people. No, they're copies. Like that's what they are. They are inferior by nature copies of the original inhabitants of this ship and the original Earth people and the original Urbankans. Saving them on microchip doesn't magically make it so like, oh, we've got the we've got a story where you can have the stuff on on microchip, and they're still the same person. It doesn't work. Also, this is an episode where you feel like Nissa does absolutely nothing. Like, she's just sort of there to get captured. And I guess try to tell Adric how much of an idiot that he is. Which doesn't really... I mean, it doesn't not work, but it just doesn't really work because, Adric doesn't want to listen. And Nissa's arguments are, no, that's not right. Like, she doesn't actually give any argument as to why he shouldn't listen to Monarch. It's honestly it's a really as a story. This is just it's not interesting enough to sustain itself, and honestly, just kind of you just kind of wait for and hope for the best. It's just a story that you get like you just sort of get the story built around nothing happens. Like it's just sort of there as a story. It's not well written, it's not well acted. It's genuinely just an unenjoyable sort of mess of a plot that is sort of bungled together almost last minute and kind of just doesn't work. So overall, I'm going to give Forward to Doomsday Part 3 a 1 out of 10. Alright, it's the 3rd of November 2019, and I just finished watching Part 4 of Forward to Doomsday, the final episode. And, this one isn't... It's not good. It's a bad episode. This is the episode that the story is most famous for, in that it it's definitely a there's definitely maybe an idea here. This is literally one, like episode 2, episode 4 has a decent amount of dancing in the middle because that creates interesting storytelling and interesting drama for a plot, and that's totally not boring. We promise. Yeah, this is a story where you have this story about the characters, basically just going in and basically going in and not doing things. Like it's basically like, oh, it's we're starting a revolution because this is a Doctor Who story and that's what they do. We start a revolution, and in starting a revolution we are going to include a bunch of dancing, and that's going to be our big way the revolution happens is through the power of dance, which is genuinely quite silly. Like Monarch gets destroyed, like all the androids are basically put together and down to a to a story. This is something where you have where you have the characters basically built up to a built up to a story all about all about the characters you basically have them kind of just finishing up this story, um, because, uh, basically because of everything. It's very, um, it's very, it's very much a weird, um, weird sort of plot. Like, you have this point where the Doctor gets out in space and propels himself using a cricket ball back to the TARDIS. Tegan does nothing. Adric has to be convinced that, oh, maybe the villains are actually evil. And it just... This is one of those... this is one of those stories where you don't get that good of, like, just a good conclusion. You don't get a solid conclusion by any stretch of the imagination. You get a conclusion that is basically last minute, quickly put together, and basically, build up a story because of it. It's not a story where you finish everything. It's just a story that just sort of ends and just sort of builds, just sort of is like the villain is defeated by, like, oh, we have this poison, right, throw it on the villain, and the villain dies because, oh, Monarch, surprise, wasn't an android after all, which is just a twist that's, like, not built up at all, and just it's just sort of there. It's one of the, it's a really weird sort of, it's just sort of a conclusion that doesn't actually, and it's like, I just wrote an ending and now we go on, and it's like, all right, now we're moving on to the next story now. But of course, moving on to the next story in the season is also just weird, because the story ends with basically with Nyssa falling over in the TARDIS and it being like, oh, there's our cliffhanger. Now let's keep it going. That's just a weird way of doing anything, just at all. So, it's just like, surprise, the cliffhanger. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just sort of a surprise. We've stopped it now. We've stopped the story now. So overall, I'm going to give the For Doomsday Part 4 a 1 out of 10. That being said, we add up the scores and average them out to give For Doomsday a final score of 1.5 out of 10. Thank you, everybody, for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. As always, please leave a like, comment down below, because I always read the comments and I always try to respond, even if I don't always make it. And subscribe if you haven't already, so you can always stay up to date with my content. And join me next time when we take a look at the third televised story from season 19 of Doctor Who, with continuing the trend of one-word titles with Kinda.